still have folks joining us online. We'll continue to admit them as this presentation progresses. My name is Priscilla Medeiros. I'm the Knowledge Mobilization and Community Engagement Specialist at the Edwin S.H. Leong Centre for Healthy Children, as well as your moderator for this series. I'm incredibly excited to welcome our panel of speakers joining us today. So we are joined by Dr. Mavra Ahmed, who's a research associate at the Joannah Brian Lawson Centre for Child Nutrition at the University of Toronto and an adjunct professor at Ontario Tech University. Nina Trask, who's a research officer at the Lawson Centre, whose work focuses on school food programs and policies. Benjamin Organ, who's a policy lead and public health researcher at the Lawson Centre. Nicole Weber, who's a research officer at the Lawson Centre, whose research focuses on the implementation and impact of school food programs across Canada. Annette Blaze, who's an administrative officer and former researcher at the Lawson Centre, whose work has examined the landscape and nutritional quality of school food programs. Selena, I should have mentioned this. You can wave, but you'll certainly have the opportunity to meet them as we discuss through the fireside chat. Selena Quinn Brantar, thank you. Selena is a researcher at the Lawson Centre who leads the Centre's youth engagement strategy. And finally, Asma Musa, who's a registered dietitian, public health researcher, and PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. So just to ground us in today's session, it's titled School Food Community Engagement in Action. This is a fireside chat, so a little bit of a different approach to how we usually navigate our Trainee Hub sessions. This interactive panel brings together a whole host of community-based and policy-focused researchers who are going to reflect on how community engagement has been intentionally embedded throughout the life cycle of a large-scale policy-relevant research initiative. So we kindly ask that you hold your questions until the end. For those online, I will keep my eye on the chat, and we will bring those questions forward at the end. I'll hand it over now to the moderators for the fireside chat.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Great, thank you, Priscilla. So today I'll be co-moderating today's fireside chat with Mavra. So our panel is comprised of members of our research team who will introduce themselves more thoroughly in a couple moments, and he'll be sharing their perspectives throughout today's conversation. So as Priscilla mentioned, today's talk is focused on school food community engagement in action, drawing on insights and lessons from the Feeding Kids, Nourishing Minds studies and the Empowering Kids Informing Policy. So rather than centering on findings alone, the intention of this fireside chat is to look back and actually reflect on the process, specifically the community engagement that shaped these studies. So our goal today is to have an open and honest conversation about what our community engaged research looked like in practice across these projects. So over the course of this discussion, we'll explore how engagement was embedded across different stages of the research, how we built relationships and trust with a variety of different partners, and what it meant to collaborate in ways that were meaningful, including what worked well, what didn't, really grounding this conversation in those realities that might not make it into those final outputs or publications. So our hope is that you will leave with concrete, practical lessons that you can take into your own work, particularly when it comes to integrating lived experience with evidence and thinking beyond the impact to beyond the life of a single study. So with that high-level framing, I'll pass it over to Mavra, who will give us some more background on the studies and the context.
Great, thanks so much for that, Annette. So before we begin, what I'll do is sort of provide a brief background and framing of why this conversation matters. So since 2020, our Feeding Kids, Nourishing Minds initiative actually took a comprehensive multi-phase approach in understanding and strengthening school food programs across Canada. So our work really began with mapping the national landscape of school food programs, where we identified significant variability in program delivery, a heavy reliance on prepackaged foods, particularly during COVID-19 pandemic, and persistent challenges that you're going to see as related to infrastructure, staffing, and funding. But these early insights really highlighted what we needed in terms of coordinated, policy-driven approach to school food in Canada. And with that, building on that foundation, now we have launched our Empowering Kids Informing Policy work that extends beyond those insights by advancing co-design, community-engaged approaches to inform more equitable and sustainable school food and program implementation. So in our work, what I, again, just, emphasizing what Annette said, community engagement isn't something we add on at the end. It's very central to how we design, how we implement, how we do research, and how we interpret our findings, because we're living at the intersection of both policy and experience. And right now, especially with the momentum that we see around Canada in terms of the National School Food Program, and this growing emphasis on equity, I think it's even a real opportunity for us and responsibility for us to be able to include that meaningfully in both our evidence and decision making. So with that, we're really going to get into our today's conversation and unpack that and see what that looks like and the opportunities and the challenges and the lessons we learned. I think Priscilla, you did a great job introducing all of us. So we'll just take a moment. I have my background comes in food and nutrition policy. I've got a PhD in nutritional sciences with a fellowship in public health policy and artificial intelligence for public health. I'll pass it over to Nicole for a bit of a background.
Yes, thank you, Mavra. And thank you, Priscilla, for introductions as well. So just to add to the fact that I'm a research officer and registered dietitian at the Lawson Centre. I also am a graduate from the Masters of Public Health at the Joannah School of Public Health at PHEc in 2023, specializing in public health policy and community development. And overall, I've been involved in the school food research space for over 5 years now, working across academic institutions and various advocacy organizations. But through specifically the Feeding Kids Nourishing Minds study, which we'll hear a lot about today, I work more closely with school food program coordinators, with Nina, and as well as moving into more of that work with students, as well as different school staff across various school boards. And I'll be speaking from that perspective today, and with some early learnings from Indigenous-led community work as well. And I'll pass it to Nina.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Nicole. So my name is Nina. I'm also a registered dietitian and research officer at the Lawson Centre. A lot of the early work in school food started with things like global school food research and kind of seeing what's happening in different countries to help inform advocacy efforts in Canada and understanding what's happening in Canada. And then through the Lawson Centre, like Nicole said, working really specifically with those coordinators at the school level who run programs, getting understanding of their perspectives and experiences. And then you'll hear a lot today in this presentation, future research kind of looking at student voices, parent voices, and at the TVSD. And then right now, my next kind of phase of work is looking at procurement for school food programs and how we can optimize that process. So excited to be here, and I'll pass it over to Ben.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nina. And thank you so much, Priscilla, for the lovely introductions and for having us today, really. My name is Benjamin Organ, and as Priscilla mentioned, I'm a researcher with the Lawson Centre, where really my focus is primarily on the policy side of things, and really trying to work to understand the policy-making dynamics and the political determinants around school food policies in Canada, as well as bridging with all these amazing colleagues beside me, trying to incorporate a policy focus in some of the work we do. So with that, thank you for having us, and I'll pass it to Selena.
Hello, everyone. I was just thinking about how full circle it feels to be sharing some of our learnings after conducting this study last year. Some of these things were planned and some of these things we learned along the way. So it's a privilege to be here and share that so you can take it back to your own projects. My name is Selena. I have a master's in nutritional sciences where I focused on parent and caregiver perspectives of school food programs. I did a qualitative study with parents and caregivers across the GTA, and also a study that looked at the cultural perceptions of parents and caregivers of South Asian, East Asian, and Southeast Asian descent, really understanding how we could make a school food program culturally appropriate from their perspective. And today I'll be sharing some insights on co-creation and co-analysis and how that actually looks like in action. So looking forward to that. I'll pass it over to Yasmin.
Amazing. Thank you so much, and thank you for that introduction, Priscilla. My name is Esma, and I'm a first-year PhD student with the Lawson Centre. And I actually previously worked as a research assistant on the Feeding Kids Nourishing Minds project, which is a lot of the reflections today are going to be coming from there, but also some of the early beginnings of my PhD project, which specifically look at centering experiences of Black children and youth, especially here in Toronto's school food program as it continues to roll out. I'm really excited to share just like also my experiences that I do have outside of that. I do a lot of advocacy work and work with organizations around school food programming. It's a very exciting opportunity, and I'm really glad that I could be here today and that you're able to have us. Thank you.
All right, amazing. So now that you know a little bit more about us, we'd love to just check in with you and get to know you a little bit better. So feel free to join us on Slido if you're able. All right, so please select which option best describes your role. Are you an undergraduate student, a graduate student, researcher, healthcare trainee? Okay. It's looking like we have a lot of graduate students and researchers joining us today, online and in person. From here, have you had previous experience with research? Given that we're all graduate students and researchers, I would assume so. Okay, that makes sense. And for those with research experience, has anyone had experience with co-creation or community engagement? Okay. All right. So about half and half. That's really interesting. Thank you very much. Yeah, I guess we'll get into it.
Yeah, excellent. So we'll get into our lovely fireside chat right now. And my first question for our panel today is, what does community engagement work mean to you as a researcher, and why do you think it's so important in the spaces?
So I'll be starting this off. For me, community engaged school food program, like research or the school food space, is very much important because it really does reflect, I guess, the realities of the schools and communities that are intended to be served by a lot of the policies that we're researching, a lot of the outcomes that we're researching, and so it's really important to put like a face, I guess, to the outcomes that we are seeing in our research. And more beyond that, I would say like it's important to consult the community in the co-creation process, because a lot of the times communities and the people who are directly impacted by school food programs are oftentimes an afterthought. So perspectives, one thing that I really did appreciate actually when I joined the Feeding Kids Nourishing Mind project is specifically the attention to student perspectives. And especially, you might be wondering why this is important. And as we know, the National School Food Policy, was back in 2024, was put out there. It kind of set out some vague guidelines with very little in terms of like implementation and how to action it. How to operationalize is the word I was looking for. It kind of was a little bit limited in that capacity, but then now we have the legislation to further support that. And then you look at Toronto on a scale, I guess, on a municipal scale. Toronto is currently rolling out their school food program, making sure that every school has a school food program. Currently, not every school does. We kind of live in a little bit of a mosaic situation where no two schools have the same like snack program or morning program. Some of them don't have lunch programs, while others don't. So it's kind of all over the place. And so they're looking to kind of standardize at least the morning snack component of it for 2026. And then for 2030, they're looking to have a lunch program in every school. And so when you really think about that, community perspectives, school food program is actually rooted in community advocacy initiatives. It's a grassroots movement, if you think about it. And so being true to the grassroots movement that school foods programming started from, I think it's important that our research does consider the community leaders, the students, the people who are directly impacted by the policies that are being made. And it's one of the questions that I would always ask myself, especially having gone into the city of, the city when they were trying to pass the universal school food plan. I went in and, I deputed, which was a very unique and new experience for me. But when I was deputing, I really looked around and was like, oh, a lot of the people who we were working with in our project are not really represented here. And a lot of the times that's where my drive for equity in school food programs comes from, is a lot of the people were maybe have grandchildren that are in the school system, the public school system, but it was a bit challenging to kind of gauge their ability to truly grasp the role of community and other things that I was deputing about. And so ultimately, it's important to consult the people that are impacted by the research and the outcomes of that research. So I think that's where I will pass it off to Nicole.
Beautiful, and I really echo and will weave through what Asma's already said, and just also touch on how community engagement evolved through the FKNM study over time. But I'll first start off that I really enjoy this question for the fact that it brings into the questioning of what does community engagement means to us as researchers. And part of that is to be really intentional with our engagement, because you could be very superficial or performative when you're saying community engagement. But we really want to really, as I said, ground this work in the lived experience of those key interest holders and partners, previously we called them key stakeholders, connected to and impacted by school food. And so really this, as a researcher, we need reflexivity. What I mean by that, that means that as researchers, we're constantly checking our role in shaping the research. We really think about the worldviews, the biases, the assumptions that we're bringing to the research, and that will help support the self-assessment of whether the work is really truly serving the communities it's intended to serve. So really, we're moving from not just input or consultation, but really meaningful involvement in shaping the work. And so that means really being open to adapting and pivoting along the way. And part of that as well is bringing a collaborative spirit to work. That really means like we're valuing that community expertise as Marie said, like this work has already been done. It's grassroots, it's already been, the work is there. And so that really means for us is creating a space for shared decision-making, that co-creation, to really help support engagement of the communities in this work. And this is why this is important in the school food context in particular, is as I said, it's very decentralized right now. Essentially, it's all at the school level that the communities have these school food champions have come up in the space, really recognizing a need in their communities and creating their programs from the limited resources that they have. So they really hold so much expertise in there. And so for us, that means, you know, recognizing that disconnect in policy and school realities. So community engagement becomes this very much this critical bridge that can help fill the gap, create opportunities for co-creation where communities can really begin shaping the work. And in doing so, we're going to have some stronger buy-in and ultimately hopefully more relevant and impactful policies. Now, leading into how the FKM study as a whole evolved in this is that, as Mavra beautifully said, is that while community engagement is already a core piece, but there's always that work before the work. So for us, that was that national landscaping, moving into more regional work, for Nina and I working across Ontario, and for Selena working in Toronto and the GTA. But that allowed us over time to really understand what was happening in the school food space. And then also along the way, build those valuable connections and relationships, leading into one of the studies I think a lot of us will talk to today is our study with the Toronto District School Board, which was increasingly became more community engaged. And so as that work involved really engaging coordinators, students, families, and school partners to understand student health outcomes and program implementation across different types of programming. So this led to a lot of as we were going through, we were really scaffolding how much community engagement we started with, and ultimately it has led to even our most community engaged, community-led work between Asma and I with a Black food sovereignty and Indigenous food sovereignty programming. So that really supported us as a team to build our own capacity to engage in this work along the way. So we really started from the systems level of understanding what's happening to then embedding more engagement across the process. So I think the key takeaway I just want to say here is that community engaged work can really grow and evolve over time, especially when you embed reflexivity within that practice, have that spirit of collaboration, and then also really ultimately the goal is to get to that co-creative piece so that we can really co-create research that really is going to help inform policymakers, be it within communities, school boards, or within government, to have that more relevant, equitable, impactful policies. I'll switch off to the next question or topic.
Yeah, thank you so much. So what did early engagement look like, and how did you get the ball rolling on that? I don't know, Nicole, if you maybe want to start us off on that one.
I think that leads well talking about the Toronto District School Board study, because that was one of our, I think, most recent completed large-scale community engaged project. And really, I think to get the balls rolling, really getting involved early in the space. Invest time in the work before the work is what we would say. Really to start building those relationships and trust in the space. Many of us are already deeply involved in the school food space through our own either experience as students or researchers, research assistants, working with advocacy groups such as the Coalition for Healthy School Food. And so we already bring in these existing relationships that we continue to foster and build. But in practice, what does that actually look like as a graduate student, as many of you are here? And really, I want to shed light to the value of informal approaches, and that for us, especially Nina and I in our early beginnings as we were in our MPH program,
we attended so many webinars and so many meetings that and anything we were invited to, we said yes, and anything we could find, we attended. And when we were in those spaces, we were so active. We were asking questions. We were engaged in the chats. And then we would make connections in the Zoom chats to talk to other people outside of that. So I just wanted to really shed light so that it can be in those informal moments that are just as important. And so we had that consistent presence. We were developing relationships with visibility. And then what then happened is that we actually, even through our internship, actually led to an opportunity to working with the Feeding Kids Nourishing Minds study. And that was with that, again, gathering those perspectives of school food coordinators. So at that point, it became more formal. We were starting to actually host meetings ourselves with people in the space. So basically trying to understand, we were meeting with people who were within the school boards or running those lead funding agencies for school food programming or the school food organizations. And this really much not only fostered relationships and visibility, but also strengthened our understanding of research interests along the way, and which we continue to hone over time. And also that allowed us to actually build and expand the study. Initially, we started GTA and then we went across Ontario. And I just want to point out a practical tip here is that really keep track of your connections. We started with an Excel sheet, and I can't say how much that has evolved over time, and now the entire team continues to add to it because these are so valuable, these connections, and you don't want to lose them once you make them. So ultimately, that momentum we were building with our visibility and credibility with us as researchers and also as a Lawson Centre actually led to not only our work being increasingly being informed by school communities, our school board communities, meaning, it's important that the research done is seen as important to the community by the community. It also meant that we already had experience, like we had already previously engaged with the Toronto District School Board. So the seed was already planted. They were already aware of us. So by the time they approached us, they felt confident that we could help support them in their needs. And so I guess my key takeaway there is to start early, invest in the work before the community engaged work. Informal is just as important as formal engagement, and that this engagement is cumulative over time. Relationships, presence, being responsive to what you're hearing. And I don't know if anyone from the panel wants to add to that.
Well said.
Based on what we've heard so far, I think the audience might want to understand what about approaches to co-creation? Can you go into a little bit more detail how we would manage that with Toronto District School Board or with other partners?
Yeah, I'd love to jump on that question. So our approach to co-creation really stemmed from a priority to ensure alignment with the values and goals of the Toronto District School Board. I think as researchers, sometimes we go into projects with very tight timelines. We just want to get the research done, we want to collect the data, we want to analyze, we want to get manuscripts out, but that's very extractive. And so we want to involve the communities in the work that we're doing through a co-creation process. So it doesn't only become your research, but it becomes their research project as well. And another reason why co-creation is extremely important is because of feasibility and acceptability. The research can't happen if the community members don't want to participate in it. And so in order for you to understand if something's feasible, for example, in a school context, you need to talk to the community members and you need to design data collection protocols with them so that they can actually work in practice and not theoretically. So one of the ways in which we had a co-design process was we had a project advisory committee. And so this project advisory committee comprised of people from the Toronto District School Board, teachers, administrators, various people in the school board who wanted to provide feedback on our study and help us design it. And so within this project advisory committee, we also had smaller working groups. And so these are the groups that actually helped us design different aspects of the project. So for example, I'll be talking about our naturally occurring focus groups. There are people who helped us design the surveys, people who helped us design, again, focus group questions, our plate waste study, our 3-day food records. So they helped us with those different aspects. And the reason why we had these small working groups was we really wanted the the committee members to decide where they felt their expertise would make the most impact. We wanted them to focus on areas that resonated with them the most, and basically decide where they wanted to contribute within this larger advisory committee. So as I mentioned, one example that I wanted to talk about was the naturally occurring focus groups. And you're probably wondering, what is a naturally occurring focus group? So essentially, in our context, it was a teacher-led focus group within the classroom. Usually, focus groups are led by researchers, sometimes in a space that is not familiar to the participant. But because these naturally occurring focus groups were for children, were for students, we really wanted them to be in a space where they felt comfortable to share their thoughts about a school food program. And that might not be a researcher asking them questions in like a research space. So in addition to our project advisory committee, we had a naturally occurring focus group working group. And this working group was composed of teachers from the Toronto District School Board. And what we did with that working group is we had several meetings with them to design a working group, a naturally occurring focus group protocol. So one of the things we did is we created activities for students who didn't want to participate, to make them, who didn't want to participate in the naturally occurring focus group, to help them feel included. They helped us link the curriculum to the actual focus group. We created the focus group questions together, and each question was linked again to the curriculum. We also created activities for students to do before the naturally occurring focus group, so the time students to get them ready and excited for that naturally occurring focus group. And the goal with all of these materials was to make it seamlessly integrate into the lesson plans that teachers would have, and to make it low burden. Teachers are very busy people, and if you're adding another thing onto their to-do list, most likely they're not going to want to participate. So that was one of the reasons why we wanted to make a very clear, easy, flexible, naturally occurring focus group protocol. And so the co-creation didn't end there. We had this protocol, but how do you actually implement it within each specific school? So within each school, we had one-on-one conversations with the teachers who agreed to participate. We made ourselves easily accessible to the teachers and showed them what the protocol looked like and asked them, how would this work in your classroom context? We worked with their schedules. We worked with the things that were already happening in their classrooms. We were flexible to change question structures, but keep the essence of them. So although we had this co-creation process with our working group, there was still co-creation happening within the school level on a one-to-one basis. And so overall, I guess the key takeaway here is that co-creation can look like a lot of different things. But the very first step to co-creation, I think, would be to establish accountability structures. Strong engagement can't happen without intentional structures for communication and accountability. And so these, as projects become very busy, like ours did, these structures help maintain consistency, alignment, and trust. So one of the accountability structures was the project advisory committee, and then from that accountability structure came other working groups. And so in addition, the importance of these accountability structures really is, it enables touch points throughout the project, right? We don't want to have just isolated points in time where we touch base with the community. We need something there set in stone from the very beginning to ensure that it happens throughout.
Yeah, I can add a little bit. I might go, go ahead, Nancy, yeah.
All right. Well, it sounds like trust and building relationships is really important throughout this process. I'm not sure if anyone wants to expand a bit more on that. How do you build these relationships and establish trust? If there's any concrete examples, that would be lovely.
Yeah, okay, great. That's actually exactly what I was going to go back to, was kind of like before we got into having a specific agreement that we were even going to do co-creation, was that building relationships and establishing trust. And so I guess what I'm about to speak to is kind of halfway between what Nicole was talking about with the early work and where Selena was with once we actually had those relationships. And this isn't actually necessarily something, like we were thinking about how do we want to explain this in the Trainee Hub, reflecting on it. So when we were doing this wasn't necessarily the terminology we used or the plans we had, but I'm just going to try to explain it in the way that after we reflect on it, this is kind of how it happened. So as we were, as Nicole mentioned, in the school food space, we had some familiarity with the TDSB and with other school food researchers. They knew that we were interested in this work, and we had made a couple connections. And one of our community members actually reached out to us and said, you know, we're looking at doing an impact study. We want to update some of our old data. We want to have a better understanding of why school foods matter, Do they matter? How do they affect students? And is your team like interested in doing that kind of work? And we were like, yes, that is a great alignment of our interests. And we have capacity and expertise in that area, and you have capacity and expertise in your community space. So that was already kind of a great spark of like, this might be something we could work on together. And we, over time, had these meetings and these conversations where we started to build a real relationship and we built trust with each other. And if you think about like pull yourself out of work or out of being out of a researcher or anything, in real life, like it takes time to build relationships and it takes time to build people's trust. And so something that we realized to happen for us was we ended up building these like anchor relationships, which were really, really important and deeply invested relationships with a couple of the key members of the community. So you'll probably hear us say it a couple times today, but the nutrition liaison officers, those were a group of professionals who worked with the Toronto District School Board and with like individual schools to help implement their programs. They are deeply tied to every single school and their program. They are in the community, they have intimate knowledge of the schools and their needs, and they're passionate about the work. So that made them a really awesome relational person in our work, and that transitioned into a partnership. The other one that I want to mention is the External Research Review Committee, which was the TDSB. When you do work with school boards, you have to get ethics approval both from the University of Toronto, but also from the school boards. And they gave us kind of that like ethical backbone and institutional trust. So because we were working with them, and because we knew them really well, they were able to like say, you know, we're working with the ERC. So then when we talk to principals or we talk to other community members, they were already understanding that our team was coming in through their system. We were honoring their methods. We were doing things their way. And I think that that establishes trust too, because then they know, like Selena mentioned extractive practices earlier, we're not coming in with our own agenda and doing our own thing. We came in with open mind, with questions, and with a really like a strong willingness to do things their way and to collaborate about it. So yeah, in terms of like building relationships and trust, there's the work before the work, which Nicole mentioned. I'll do a little resource plug too. If you're really interested in learning more about the work before the work, the University of Manitoba has a great resource called Working in Good Ways. And it's a framework for this kind of relational community engagement work specific to working with Indigenous communities, but it really translates a lot of the same things that you could practice. So yeah, some of the approaches we really took were like meetings, conversations, talking about our shared interests, and then starting to involve them in the creation of the study so they knew it was a partnership and not us coming in with our own work. Yeah.
I mean, what are some of the other realities of community engagement that people don't often talk about?
Yeah. Okay, I can start with this one and then I'll probably pass it along. But when you're working with community, you have to remember these are real people and they all have their own ideas, they all have their own ways of doing something. So something that we would come into is we'd have this idea that like we talked to our anchor relations and we said, oh, this is what they really want to see happen. And then we go talk to maybe like a principal or the school level and they'd say like, that's not going to work for us. We need something that looks different. So I think understanding that when you're doing community engagement, none of those communities are a monolith. You're going to have people who have different ideas, different ways of wanting to do something. And so one of the kind of approaches that we took was when we hit a bump, you know, someone wanted something one way, someone wanted something another way. We held a meeting and we had an honest conversation about these are the different types of perspectives that are being shared. These are the ways that we could go forward together. What do we want to do? And so you try to work with majority, if you can, consensus, but that can be really difficult. But really just being open and honest about, you know, this was something, like for example, a consent form. Consent forms are incredibly important to researchers. We need to know that you have agreed to do this and that you're informed. But if you think about students and parents and language barriers, it can be a real barrier to participation. And so we kept hearing from our community partners, we don't want consent forms. We just want verbal consent. We don't want to have to sign anything. It's too confusing and it's too much. But as researchers, and I'm sure as many of you know, it's great that a lot of your graduate students and have done research, you know that that's not an option. We can't go back to the ethics board and say like, we just couldn't get consent. So we actually had a really creative approach to this where we went, okay, we need the consent form, but we're going to simplify it as much as possible with the support of the External Research Review Committee. So with their own ethics people, we'll make sure that that works for them. And then Selena actually went ahead and made these awesome videos where she kind of like explained what the study is and how do you consent to it so that somebody had like a visual representation and they didn't just have to read this like dry text about what they were being asked to do. And that really improved our recruitment and participation. So just another example of like, yeah, how you might move forward. And just because someone says I don't like that idea, or I want to do something different, it doesn't mean it has to be adversarial. It actually means they're really passionate and they care a lot. So they're giving you input that you can actually use to inform your study and do something that will work for the community. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, I'll be talking about it a little bit when I talk about knowledge translation, but you really need to get creative. Sometimes handing people a package, like I don't know, a lot of words or papers, and telling them this is what the research is about, they're not going to understand, they're not going to want to be engaged with it. So in addition to like the consent form videos, we had videos that explained the entire project, I think in like 5 minutes or like 3 minutes, even shorter for like the younger students, and they were cartoons. So we would come into the classrooms and show this video to the students and let them ask us questions, get them excited, put things in simple terms so that they actually understood what was happening. And I think we called ourselves school food explorers. We didn't even use the word researchers because like a grade 2 student isn't really going to understand what is a researcher. So we did little things like that, and so there's a lot of opportunities to be creative and connect with the community in that way. So it's a lot of fun. That was beautiful. I love that. And I'm just going to add and maybe just summarize what we just heard from Selena and Nina in kind of something a little bit quippy, but basically to summarize, it's the time, the tensions, and the trade-offs. And so I would just say that community engaged work really needs a lot of time. And I think when you think of the scope of your graduate work or if you're a student or if you're any other capacity, there is that feeling of limited time. So then being really reflective of what's actually feasible and being honest about that, and just know that this is where you might have to pivot or change your study given the time it takes to build relationships and for the community to engage. So I think being very aware and okay that it takes time. Like I think that's really hard where we feel the pressures of the institutional kind of timelines. And that goes into some of the tensions. And this is not negative. Again, speaking to what they said, these are just a reality. You're going to have tensions between what you need as the realities as a researcher with your community partners, and within that, again, community is not monoliths. You have different people in the community that you're navigating all these tensions and interests. So I think it's just I think what approach we did is we were really great at listening. Anytime someone brought a concern, we didn't treat it as a concern, we treat it as a consideration for us as a research team that then we discussed amongst each other. And then we also discussed with our partners to see if we can basically come to a point of, I call it a trade-off, but really compromise, adaptation, or whatever within the scope of the study that worked as best as possible for everyone. And so, for example, one would be that, when we were reflecting, we had these 3-day food records, essentially the students were doing from elementary to high school, and that required them to journal everything they ate in a day across 3 days. And we had that 3 times, so every other month or so. And we quickly realized that was a very big challenge for the students. And so we kind of had to make a trade-off there of, okay, I think to preserve the relationships and the engagement of our students in the study, we ultimately decided for some schools not to do the full 3. It was just capacity challenges, and that is something we had to just consider, and then also just reflect on in terms of the future of like what can we learn. And there are different things we could have considered, technology for example, but then again, equity, it's hard to have use phones for you're thinking of taking pictures of food, but again, these are all just considerations, and it's always important to engage in the community in this decision making process, because again, they know. And so but the question does come to a point, and I just want to highlight this too, is that sometimes it's okay to recognize that there's a point to adaptations or trade-offs that you have to be open to. And that came up in our work as well, because, we have to recognize the limits of both the study and our own as researchers, because we, for example, the nutrition liaison officers brought an amazing opportunity for us during our recruitment phase to engage Indigenous-focused schools. They're operating amazingly comprehensive programming, Indigenous food sovereignty, that we have a lot to learn from. And so we actually met with the Indigenous education leaders and quickly realized within this study, because it was just not, how would I say this? Not a fit, to be honest, just because that kind of work really does require engagement from the start. We didn't want it to be tokenistic or extractive, as we said. So we had that discussion, and we were open and transparent about our capacity and our limits. And so, but that was involved in that was a really humble and responsive decision making that was made with the Indigenous education leader. And actually what resulted is that we said, this is very important work, not now, but future. And so then we were able to build out that more intention from the beginning and actually go back to the more work before the work. And that's actually where our team spent over a long time just doing the deeper educating ourselves, especially on cultural safety and humility, indigenous ways of being and knowing, and also indigenous data sovereignty. We needed the capacity, OCAP exactly, data sovereignty training. So at that point, then through that, we were able to prioritize the relationship and the ethics in that space. So that's just to say that, again, sometimes that's a reality. Sometimes these don't work out, and that's okay. But we protected the relationship, the trust, and we actually set ourselves up to be better aligned with the community for future work.
Okay, amazing. So beyond study design and implementation, are there ways of engaging the community from the standpoint of knowledge translation, dissemination, co-analysis?
I'd love to speak on this. So yes, absolutely. There are various meaningful opportunities for the community to engage in the research project beyond study design and implementation, and particularly in analysis and knowledge translation. So involving the community that you're working with at this point is very critical to ensure that the findings are interpreted in ways that are accurate, relevant, and grounded in lived experience. And so co-analysis can take several forms. One of that might be involving community members to collaboratively review emerging findings. It could be identifying key themes together from like qualitative analysis. It could also involve sense checking, so ensuring that interpretations reflect community realities and not just academic perspectives. Another way is for community members to help highlight what feels most important to them. They can also tell us what's missing in the data and how results should be contextualized. And so our team approached co-analysis and co-interpretation in several intentional ways. And one of these ways was actually involving the project advisory committee in a co-analysis session. And so during this co-analysis session, we showed them some preliminary findings from an aspect of our study. So specifically, we were looking at the survey results. And we engaged members of the committee in a structured discussion. And so just for accessibility, these sessions were held online just because the members came from various parts of Toronto. And again, they're very busy. So just having an online space to do this co-analysis session made sure that a lot of people could be involved. And we also designed these sessions to be highly interactive. So as we shared some of the preliminary results, we embedded polls so that we could get their instant reaction to some of the things that we were sharing. And then after those polls, we dived into like a deeper discussion. And so we guided the conversations with questions like this. So we asked, what stands out to you in these preliminary results? What school level factors might help explain these patterns? And how should students and school communities be engaged in the next phase of interpretation? And what types of outputs or resources would be most meaningful? So those were just some of the questions that we would ask. And depending on how many people would come to the co-analysis session, they would be in breakout groups. If it was a smaller group, we could just have a large group discussion. And we would have someone taking notes throughout, and we would share what was discussed during those sessions and create action items on what would the next steps be. So we also extended this work to engage teachers and administrators who are actually involved in the data collection. So for example, for the schools that were involved in the plate waste study, so essentially what our team did is we went on site and we collected foods that were wasted specifically from the school food program. We had teachers who were teaching grades 1 to 3, and also the administrators, we invited them to participate in a co-analysis, or inviting them to participate in a co-analysis session. Where we'll be doing sort of the same thing, showing them the preliminary analysis results and kind of drawing on their on-the-ground experience at the school level. So we want to interpret the findings again with their lived experience. We want to identify contextual factors that may have impacted the results. And also, we would want them to surface any gaps or nuances in the data. And so moving forward into knowledge translation, our team is right now prioritizing more accessible and engaging approaches to knowledge translation. So we acknowledge that traditional academic outputs like manuscripts, they're not the most meaningful way to share findings with school communities. I mean, imagine telling a principal, can you share this manuscript in your newsletter? I doubt anybody's gonna click this like 20-page manuscript and say, oh, that was so exciting. So what we're working on right now is looking for creative methods on how we can share the results with the school communities that we've worked with. We work with 12 different schools, and so we want to come back to them and say, thank you so much for participating, and this is the impact of your participation. So we're looking at creative methods like digital storytelling. We're looking at using videos, visuals, narrative-based formats, getting the students involved in the co-analysis and the knowledge translation. Maybe they could create artwork. So there's so many different ways that we could translate the knowledge and reconnect with the participating schools and communities in a more engaging and accessible way. And essentially showing them how their contributions shaped the research and what came out of it. And so overall, co-analysis is about, and also engaging our community members in the knowledge translation process. It shifts from the perspective of research on to research with. And how that happens is you really need to recognize that community members are experts in their own right. I think sometimes as researchers, even to the general public, they might be viewed as the experts, but no, the community members are the experts in their own right, and they need to shape each stage of the research project with you. And you also need to ensure that their voices shape not just what we study, but how we understand and how we share what we learn. So that's sort of what I wanted to share for this aspect. And yeah, I guess we can move on to the next question.
Oh, I did want to add just like one thing to that too, is like, because we had the project advisory committee, not all of these ideas for co-analysis and co-creating knowledge translation came from our team either. Some of the coolest ones, like the getting students involved and maybe they do like a project or maybe they do art for us, came from us learning that that's happened in the community before. And they've asked students, you know, here's a short summary of something, make a piece of art about this or make a little video about this. And we didn't even realize that that was a possibility, that we could engage students in that way and that the school board would support us in doing that. So yeah, when you're doing that collectively with community, like go to them for ideas too. Say, how would this be meaningful for your community? How could we get students engaged? And they gave us some ideas that I don't think we would have thought were possible without their input.
They can also help ease any barriers in that process, because I think there's a lot of barriers that we're not aware of, especially even regarding consent or recruitment or just bringing awareness to that.
Sorry, this is a very great question, but I do want to say like one last thing that I think is important to consider is like empowerment. A big part of community-based participatory research is to ensure you empower communities that you involve in your research. And so a lot of the times they're like, communities are trying to advocate for themselves in a space, and sometimes they're not given the space to. And if a study does come out and if they have information to be able to support themselves, especially in environments where lived experience may not be as valued, it is incredibly important that you share that information and that they are able to interpret that for themselves as well. So about that process of like kind of a co-analyzing and knowledge translating, that's really important that the community is not only reflecting it, but they're able to also use information to effectively advocate for themselves.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, as we think about knowledge and generation and knowledge translation and the idea of how it can make an impact, I think we also see on the other side, policies has their own constraints to them, their tensions and opportunities there. So I wonder if you could speak to, how does community engaged research intersect with policy in this space, just when we think about making an impact?
Maybe I take that one. Okay. Well, I'll start by saying fantastic question, and I'll talk a little bit about the role that community voices play in policy, generally speaking. Now, no matter what we would like to think, sometimes as researchers who obsess over statistical significance and data sets and numbers, the truth is, in policymaking, oftentimes community voices and stories, they speak louder than data and numbers. Community voices, what we've learned is that if they're amplified and if they're championed effectively, they give insights into the realities of voters. And at the end of the day, policymakers, whether in the government, whether in organizations, whether in programs, they're beholden to their constituents, the people which their policies and programs affect on the ground. And when we think from a Canadian context around, okay, well, what are the examples where the amplification of these voices has led to policy change? Well, there's frankly too many examples to talk about today. Some that come to mind that our healthcare-oriented audiences might be aware of. Jordan's principle, for instance, a truly foundational change in health equity policy across Canada for Indigenous communities. That was largely rooted in community engagement, involving community engaged researchers, involving advocates, media, and communities rising up. In the school food context, when I think about my own work, going through federal records and seeing what the discourse is around school food, I think about a program called the Food Sharing Project in Kingston. Now, this initiative is a small collection of community organizations, procurement partners, and school food programs. And funny enough, you might not believe it, but they're talked about oftentimes in Parliament Hill, in the House of Commons, in front of hundreds of politicians. And furthermore, if you go into the committees who actually oversee and develop these policies, this small niche program from a small to medium-sized Ontario town is well known amongst these committee members. They talk about it in terms of the impact on community. And why is that? Well, it's because you had people involved in these projects who are willing to champion those community voices, raise them up, raise the impact that these programs are having on communities. And as researchers, that is an opportunity and a privilege that we have. Now, those examples, those are really high level, but not all policy lives in Parliament Hill or down the street in Queen's Park. I encourage us all, think municipally, this beautiful city which we're in right now. Think about organizations, hospitals, universities, institutions. Think about the programs whose policies and designs actually affect people. But one thing in common about all of these is that community voices, they need policy entrepreneurs. They need champions, as Nicole and Asma said. And you might be saying, well, who are these people? Well, advocates, policymakers, as Asma shared, community leaders, community organizations, the media, all these folks, all these interest holders can rally behind community voices and actually drive change. Well, then you might be saying, well, Ben, I'm joining this call as a nursing student. I'm not an advocate. Well, I say that's wonderful. That means you bring such a beautiful positionality to this conversation, being able to raise these voices. And that's a conversation we've had many times at the Lawson Centre. Truthfully, we are not positioned to be advocates. We are positioned to work with communities, to work alongside, to generate knowledge, and then to empower those folks who would engage in advocacy, who engage in government relations, all those pieces. And through that approach, we've really been able to build some remarkable relationships with so many incredible partners, some of whom are the most influential players in the space. We think about, as Nicole and Nina shared, working with Toronto District School Board to collaborate on projects and inform programming. We think about our conversations that we've had with lead agencies to provide updated evidence and community insights. We think about how we have worked very closely with advocates who drive impact across all levels of government, and then the community organizations and civil society that we work with and explore conversations with, who act on the ground to drive that change. Now, it's through all of those incredible engagements and opportunities, it's really shown us the importance of integrating a bit of a policy focus into the work we do. It's led to amazing training here at PHEc through the Policy Accelerator, remarkable. It's led to the Empowering Kids Informing Policy initiative, where really our work now is focused on addressing the key questions related to school food policy. And ultimately, all this led us to research that not only explores those community and interest holder voices, but really leverages them to drive that systems level change that we all hold near and dear. And I know I went on a bit of a tangent there, but I'd like to open the floor to my colleagues. Anyone else have thoughts on this?
I was going to say, sometimes actually policies do work in your favor. In my case, definitely there was that initial start where, again, with the current FPNM study, there was a school intended to include in there. And it's a very unique school, and the only one in Canada that is an Afrocentric school. And they kind of were like, this may not be the right time for us. And it's interesting because Toronto is a very unique space, especially in my project. I feel honestly very privileged to be in a place like Toronto. in the sense that we do have a Black food sovereignty plan in the city. We do have the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. We do have the TSB has a couple of initiatives supporting Black students. And so when I really thought about it, I said, this is a fantastic project to bring into this space. But how all those spaces intersect is incredibly difficult. I think, as we said, community partners have varying perspectives. And what you prioritize, for example, there are universal income and a lot of other things are at the top of their list. So school food may not always be at the top of their list. So you have to find your people sometimes, especially when you have policy that already mandates it. You already have the, in the national school food policy, you have that component that asks explicitly for inclusivity, which culturally responsive foods are a part of. In a city like Toronto, it would be really wonderful to engage the community in that kind of research. And so one other thing is, I always ask myself, who is sitting, especially when you go into spaces where, again, having had that experience of being a part of the Universal School Food Plan, process, like the process of the policy being formed and passed, it was really interesting to see the points people brought up. And it's interesting because a lot of the times I will say it, it's a call it out, but sometimes you look at it and you're like, oh, that person looks like me. They probably understand what our community needs. But you have to understand, unless the community quite literally is present and is invited into that space, where there should be created actually beforehand. So inviting the community into that space makes a big difference, because it took for an MP that we had a conversation with, it took the engagement of community, his constituents, to truly understand why there was a need in their community. They were initially voting against the Universal School Food Plan here in Toronto. And it's very interesting to kind of see, sorry, I'm not city council, my apologies. And it was really interesting to see that shift after engaging community in that conversation, asking community, hey, just so you're aware, make sure you're getting in touch with your constituents, your city councilors. And they kind of did an outreach, and they, reached out to him, and he was getting a lot of requests, like, why don't you want school food programs in Toronto? And again, reality is sometimes it just takes for you as a researcher, as a person who's involved in that space, not to be tokenized, but to open up the space to the community for them to be able to advocate for their needs. I don't have children that are in school, so I do understand that my perspectives are limited in that capacity. I do have siblings who go to public school and who participate in school food programming. But again, that's not everybody's experience. So in terms of policy, if there's policy that's there to support you, it's great. But advocating for an angle that also supports your research, not your research, but community needs, when you conduct community needs assessment, is really important. So school foods may have not been considered initially for Toronto's Black Food Sovereignty Plan. It is now a really talked about thing. Community organizations that work at schools are coming and saying, hey, just so you're aware, this is an area or a sector that we need to pay attention to. Things are moving along in policy, and I think this is a good time for us as a community to come together and advocate effectively to ensure that culturally responsive foods are available, that community microeconomics is valued in the sense that we're including local food growers. And I know in an urban environment we can't grow that much food, but at the same time, it's the intentions that matter, and the focus on bringing community into every decision that is being made about policies along the way, because they do happen, like Ben said, without necessarily the research to back it, right? But yeah, just very exciting opportunities happening in policy, and it's good to leverage those opportunities for communities when we can.
Yeah, I can add also just one more thought on terms of a more local level policy shift. So I really love what Ben and Asma shared, especially that opening space for community. But also sometimes the work that you're doing in community engagement, they also might have a policy agenda or an ask that they're making. And so for us in the TDSB, they were hoping that by working with us and updating the research, we would also be able to help them update their nutrition strategy, which can set the agenda for a lot of their school board and a lot of their school food programming. So the other comment there is just, when you have the community engaged and they trust you and they believe in the results that you brought, they can really bring you into the fold of their policy change too. And positively, that'll look like direct and significant change in the schools based on what we heard from those schools. So that's also a really exciting kind of way that you can be involved in a very, very local level of policy change through your community engagement. And did you want to add anything else? Otherwise, how are we doing? Go for it.
I will speak very briefly on this. I think to add on to everyone is also it's we do have examples when there wasn't a sufficient enough community engagement in policy. And I think we have an example from the food and beverage policy in Ontario. So this basically sets nutrition standards for those foods sold in schools, including food and beverages. And so while well-intentioned to improve the nutrition of students in schools, there were challenges in terms of the implementation that might have been foreseen had more engagement been, and that included the fact that there was a need for additional funding for these healthier foods. There was an additional need for human resources and training, and as well taste. The students have to enjoy it. Like, that's a big piece of this. And unfortunately, what ended up happening is that students were increasingly going off campus, and this is particularly speaking to cafeterias in high schools. Then the role of high schools, cafeterias in those high schools, was to generate income, and it's part of the role they play. And unfortunately, because this movement of students out, then you have these cafeterias not seen no longer viable, or they didn't have at least the funding to achieve the goal that they were, or the objectives that they were set. And so it led to the closure, unfortunately. So we have to really think of this when we have these policies. And the good news is that we've seen already clear demonstrations of early engagement in this policy, both at the national level, what we heard reports, and also some of us are already in the space. So I think Nina and I in particular, and others in the space, we have a good baseline, pre-baseline of this policy that really can support informing the government, communities, and school boards. So I think that's the important piece, that we're here early to help support.
Okay, amazing. So we've seen the value of community in project design, implementation, knowledge translation, dissemination, co-analysis, policy impact. How, as projects wrap up, how do you approach these relationships? Is there a way that you sustain these relationships over time? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can go first on that one. Yeah, so we had a couple of instances. We actually haven't closed that many relationships. We're in a very fortunate time right now where there's a persistent interest in this kind of research, and the community, fortunately, and we have enjoyed working together. So there's an ongoing relationship in a lot of these areas. But that means, particularly to the study that we're talking about today, we did have to close off some of the relationships at the school level because we were done our data collection, and we were done in a lot of ways with the regular interactions. Obviously, we're circling back a little bit now with some of the work that Celine is talking about in terms of co-analysis and co-KT. But it looked a lot like being very grateful for the time that they shared and the insights that they gave and the energy they put into your project. So we put together a series of presentations for each school. We sent to the principal, and we kind of put together, this is how many students participated, this is how many teachers or all your staff who helped us run this project. These are all the ways you contributed. We literally titled the slide, like, thank you for helping us achieve, we achieved this together, like, look at what we achieved. And we would highlight for each school what their contributions were and how many students. We kind of highlight some of the impacts that this work might have. And so I was really sharing with them, like, a lot of gratitude, and also acknowledgement of what this meant for their community, what it might mean for the research going forward. So there's those presentations. We also had meetings with our project advisory committee, kind of addressing that the project was slowing down. We're going to close the data collection. This is what the next few months is going to look like. So there's a lot of really anticipating and letting them know that this is kind of the next phase of the project. And then something we want to talk about today too is that concept of sunsetting a relationship. So how do you end something that actually there isn't necessarily an immediate next path? And so one thing that we kind of landed on that happens with these schools, and it's a good example of how you close it off and then maybe you can reopen in the future, is you just in a good way, you acknowledge that the relationship is coming to a close. And so you kind of have those conversations with them, you talk about what that might look like, and then you leave it open. Do you have any questions? Is there anything that we can do for you further? Is there any gaps that are remaining that maybe we can add to our list and say, maybe we look at that for future research? And that happened in a number of our communities where they said, yeah, this doesn't work for us now, but maybe later. And now we're at maybe later, and we have Nicole and Asma doing specific work with them, and or maybe later, and we have Selena coming back and saying, hey, are you interested in doing any of this co-analysis with us? So I think it looks like having those conversations, showing and expressing gratitude, and then just leaving the door open if you can. And if you truly can't leave the door open, so if you're a graduate student right now and you're leaving and this project's ending, you can be very clear about that. I'm moving on to a different role, or I'm moving into this different space. But you can also connect them with who's still in that space. You build these relationships, other people. You can connect them and say, if I was to leave, I would say maybe I can pass you to my colleague Nicole. and I can make that introduction, have a meeting with you so that you become familiar, and there's that budding of that new relationship. So there's ways to move it forward in a good way, and the main idea is you don't leave them hanging. You don't finish the project and it's see you later, we'll never talk again. So it's that kind of conscientious close. Does anyone else want to?
Just really briefly, just something a little bit more kind of administrative is just ownership of data and acknowledgements, and just making sure you're very clear about the long-term outcome, and also if they ever want to come back and in terms of just how we acknowledge in the future, or how they want to have access, what does that look like? It's just those are kind of wrap up communication, so there's just no miscommunication or lack of clarity.
Oh, and the last thing I want to mention too, in terms of sustaining. So Nicole mentioned at the beginning that Excel sheet where we have all these. So we know we've kept a record, and then that way it's actually really helpful when you're onboarding, like let's say a new team member. So like as your team grows or as your team shrinks, you have this kind of record of who is this person, what was their role, how did we get to know them, and then that way that lives as like kind of a remembrance. So when you're gone, maybe someone else can go, oh, I remember this person. They worked with us 3 years ago on this project, and then you have that kind of connection, and it's sustained.
And it's helpful for Dan and myself too.
It's so helpful for the people who maybe weren't in those exact meetings all the time.
Final audit also what is owed to the community, because we owe reports that we promised as part of our own project of awareness of our publications, and also authorship, co-authorship. That's discussion, especially as we get increasingly community engaged. But yes, that's also a list we have, is who asked in the community for what, and how, when are we giving it to them? Exactly.
Anybody else want to jump in?
I was just gonna say, actually, really quickly, I think one thing that I did want to add is there is like a partnership linkage tool that is available if you're applying to like CHR grants or any of those like federal grants. There is a partnership linkage tool which is incredibly helpful and useful. This is very easy to do and fill out, and it also allows them to operate in the capacity of a collaborator or whatever capacity they see fit for themselves. This is really interesting. I find that also there are a lot of interesting opportunities that emerge from community-based participatory research, especially when it comes to co-application of these federal funds. It was of course it is challenging, but one of the things that was really wonderful, and I think the community members that we co-applied with were really grateful for, was the resources that you can become as a researcher for them. So supporting them on their CHR CV. I cannot for the life of me remember that. But that was something that really was, they were like, oh, thank you so much. And it was Annette actually who did it. So I learned how to do it from Annette. But it was really wonderful. And that's something that comes out of it. And communities are always excited to collaborate on research. I just want to let you know, there's a partnership linkage tool that is now available, which is really exciting, and for all those of us who do community-based research.
I think I'll just end up by saying, we have to keep in mind that our relationships with community engaged work, it's not static, it's dynamic, right? It keeps on moving, it keeps on evolving. We think about building relationships with our individuals, but we also think about how we can evolve to build relationships with institutions and organizations as community members themselves move on to other roles as well. So if you want to add a little bit to that aspect as well.
The restructuring.
The restructuring,
Yeah, I think so sometimes we talk about those anchor relationships, and you have to be prepared for the fact that like sometimes someone that you really, really, really relied on in the community might leave during the project. And then you go, okay, goodness, now how do I fill that gap? Because those are huge shoes to fill. And so having kind of a conversation with them as they're leaving or as they're going, so that you can understand, okay, who do I actually connect to next? It's almost what we just said, but in the inverse. So if they're leaving, do you have anyone that I could connect with? If they're going, okay, what are the last few, can I ever reach out to you? Being very clear on the communication plan. Can I reach out to you if I have a question in the future, even though you're not here anymore? They might say no, but that's good to know so that you don't burden them if they said no. So sometimes when there's like a restructuring happening or your community partners are shifting, hopefully you've developed enough relationships and trust and authenticity that you can pivot to another person and they'll be like, oh, this work matters to us too. And that's kind of the joy and the beauty of community engaged work too, is it doesn't just matter to you, it matters to the community too. So they should help it kind of stay afloat and direct you to where you need to go. We had some instances where, especially as we try to do this follow-up work, principals, if you work in schools, principals change schools all the time, and so do teachers. So we had these like awesome school level supports, and then we followed up in the fall. So our study ended in the spring, we followed up in the fall after the summer break, and we learned like, oh no, many of the principals we were relying on have gone. And so, but they're so lovely. So you reach out to them and you say, hey, I didn't realize you changed schools. Is there anyone you can connect me with here who would know? And they go, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you, I'm gone. Please contact this person. They have this folder in this room and they know exactly what to do when you get there. So just kind of keeping that relationship going and having those conversations can be really important as people change, and just being respectful that the people are going to leave. And you just chat to them about it. I just wanted to.
Especially with co-analysis, this is happening in real time, reaching out to teachers and realizing, okay, they're actually not teaching anymore, they're taking year-long breaks. But because we established such good communication at the very beginning, and also like our relationships were just like online. We actually visited these teachers, had one-on-one conversations with them. They knew who we were. So when I'm reaching out to them, they're like, "Oh, Selena, like it's good to hear from you again. Like, how's the project?" And they're, you can sense the enthusiasm already. And once you have a strong foundation, everything will flow from that strong foundation. So everything that we talked about at the beginning is very important in terms of establishing again those intentional structures where you can have community engagement throughout the project.
Well, I think everything that my colleagues have said so eloquently, it really captures the journey that our team has been on over the last several years. And so thank you everyone so much for sharing. Thank you to our moderators, and thank you to Sick Kids for having us today to the Lawson Centre. If there's one thing that you can take away from today that we hope was really clear, was that engagement with communities, with interest holders, it's a process that's ongoing. It's something that's relational, and it's something that's done with intentionality and embedded in every element of your work, or at least as much as you can. And working to engage with and amplify community voices, as you've seen, it not only enriches projects like our own, not only strengthens work, but it empowers communities. It raises voices, as Asma said, that might not normally be heard. And it drives that systems level change we all hold so near and dear. So once again, I'd love to thank everyone for being here and turn things over to Priscilla for some Q&A. We really look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions.
Thank you so much to all the presenters for joining us today. So I'd like to open it up to the room as well as to those who are online. I'll keep an eye on the chat for any questions you may have for our presenters.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. It was really fascinating to hear all the work you've done for building relationships, the policy impact. Kayla and I were really interested in your co-analysis process. I know some of the questions you mentioned was like what stood out to you, maybe what's missing, and I was really fascinated by that, like what's missing, and maybe like when you are in the analysis phase already. I know you said potentially holding some of these meetings as you're collecting the data, but like what would you do in those scenarios where you do feel like there's gaps in the data or there's some misunderstandings? It could be really cool to hear about that more.
Yeah, so we know that there's going to be gaps in the data. I'll share something from a different project that Nicole and I worked on. So we did a survey and we found the results said like, oh yeah, staffing was great, everything was good. And then we did our interviews and almost all of the responses were like, staffing is not good. We are so short staffed and we are so stressed. So we were like, okay, there's something missing between what they told us in one forum versus what we heard when they actually joined us in conversation. And so with that learning, we kind of came into this project being like, hey, we're going to want to double check that what we found actually is what they also think, because there's been that disconnect in the past. And so we held meetings actually, and we told them the intention was specifically to get their understanding and help us place the results in their experiences. And they really appreciated that. So if you're honest from the outset, like you're pretty clear, we're going to share our preliminary results with you, and we really want your input on how this lands with you. And if you share your results and they're like, that is not true for our school, or like maybe you got that because like maybe in our plate waste day, maybe we saw like bananas were wasted like crazy, right? Maybe that was the third day they served bananas that week and the kids were sick of it. So you talk to the teacher and they go, no, kids usually love the bananas, but we didn't get a delivery of apples this week. And so they've had bananas for like the whole week and they just didn't feel like it. And that changes like, oh, kids don't eat vegetables or fruits. So like, oh, they were a little bit worn out. They needed some different exposure. So it's those kind of conversations and like actually quite simple questions when you're looking at the data. Some of our questions were, these were our results. Is there anything that we might be missing in terms of insight from the sociodemographics of your community? Is there a reason that we might have only seen largely English-speaking white families in our study? And the answer was yeah, because your consent form wasn't available in all these different languages, and none of the data collection was either. And so you're not going to get the parents of the students who don't speak English as a first language. And so then we put that in our considerations as, we did our best for this to be representative, but in our capacity and with the school board partners, we couldn't translate to 32 different languages and operate the study that way. So that's what actually looks like now. We have a less than representative sample, even though we worked so hard to get as much of a spread. Does that help?
I just wanted to add that we understand we can't go back into the research. Like once you've collected the data, we closed everything. Now we do co-analysis. We didn't do co-analysis throughout. Maybe that's something that we could consider for a future project. But I just want to emphasize that co-analysis is a learning process for us and also for our community members. There are certain limitations, like as I said, like if they're seeing limitations in terms of our sample size, they're like, oh, this is like not enough people. We don't think this is a representative sample. Like you address that in your limitations. There's something to reflect on and things that we can carry on in future projects, right? Because as we mentioned, a lot of our partnerships or a lot of our community partnerships haven't really ended yet. Like there's still opportunity to do more. And I think they're very understanding to that. There's a lot of limitations in research. And then there's also some great things that come out of co-analysis. Opportunities where, oh, we didn't take that into consideration in the analysis, but we have the data and we can actually do something about it. So an example of that would be, we were showing, for example, food literacy scores across different schools, different like school food program modalities. And what we were reporting about these modalities was whether they were snack programs, lunch programs, a mixture of both programs. And then once we showed that data and showed, okay, these were like the food literacy score averages across, of the students, we had so many questions. They're like, oh, instead of just reporting the modality, like what about the other components of the school food program? How are they funded? Are they volunteer run? Like what other factors may have influenced maybe the food literacy scores? Are there food literacy components embedded into the program? So there's so many different things that our project advisory committee told us that they'd like to see in the data. And so those were some of the positives. We're like, oh, let's actually add all of these details. We had, with the school food program coordinators, we had given them a survey and also did interviews with each of them to understand all of these contextual factors about their school food programs. And now we're able to make those links with the food literacy survey scores. So that's just an example of what you can and can't do and how you can move forward.
And then I believe we had another question over here as well.
But if anyone else has a question, go ahead. Okay, I'm just curious because we do a lot of patient and partner engagement in our work, and often there's a lot of room for collaboration in the design phase and in the interpretation phase. But do you have anything to say about like what does meaningful collaboration look like while you're just running the study and you're collecting your data? Because sometimes we find there's like a bit of a lapse in how we can engage like parents and patient partners, but I'd love to know what you guys did throughout that part.
I was going to say that's a fantastic question. Thank you. One of the things actually, it was so interesting because I think, like research assistant for like, I think 4 months by the time we got to this issue. We're actually administering student surveys. And I think one of the things that came up was the framing of the questions about whether they like themselves. Mind you, this has been like a survey that's been validated, we're administering it. And so it was really important for us to consider like making that question optional, because we do not want to cause like, a psychological distress to any of the students. They brought it up and it did come up in like not just one school group, but like another one as well. And so we as a team had a conversation where like we need to make that question optional. And so you can pivot in ways that don't necessarily, I would say, I guess, do not necessarily still allow you to continue your research the way that you're doing it, just adapting it as you go. I think that was a really great example of like how we pivoted when live feedback, we're receiving live feedback from one of our the tools we were administering. So yeah, I'm not sure if you want to add something.
Yeah, do you want to go first? Yeah, I'm thinking too about how you're saying like how can you engage them like in actual like data collection or like when they're doing. So I think Selena's example too about the naturally occurring focus group, we use that one as a pretty solid. I would say that's a pretty solid example where we were like, okay, we're going into these people's schools. We're going to be entering their classrooms. That's going to be wicked disruptive. We need to find a way that this actually works with them and they feel like they're a part of it. And beyond our study, it's contributing to the school day and to the teacher's agenda. So like Selena said, we had all these meetings and the curriculum connections. The purpose of the curriculum connections was so that the teacher could deliver the interview during the school day and it would be considered part of their curricular achievements. And then in that, then we had the teacher actually running the interview. So they feel very involved, they're very participating. The students are participating in the conversation and they're having they just feel like they're having a conversation with their teacher. And so we had kind of ongoing things like that where we would actively try to get our participants to be doing some of the data collection with us. I don't know if that works as well for patients and parents, but because they're children, they're young, they're vulnerable, you don't want them sitting in a room like we might be sitting today and you ask them these questions and they clam up and they don't know how to talk to you because you're a stranger. So if you can find things like a naturally occurring focus group or a way for them to be involved in the data collection, our grade 1s and 2s for plate waste, they got a little garbage bag and they got to put all their plate waste in. We didn't come around and like take it from them, right? Like they got to do that part themselves. So that was kind of exciting for them. And so ways that you can involve them, especially if they're young, like children, love to be involved. They love to see they love to be involved in that way. So that's just some examples of how we actively have them.
Speaks to the youth engagement strategy. I think Selena also very much can add to this, but I think to your discussion of patient involvement, and our thought in our own study was student involvement, and that was what we felt was missing and something, an opportunity that we want for our future studies. So that's coming up in my own project is for us is engaging students early. So that means we're actually bringing them in early to help set the research objectives, the priorities, and also how can we engage students in this? Because again, they're the experts of their own group. So please inform us how can we. Also, we have the school staff there to also again ease the involvement of students because again, there's ethical considerations. There's a lot to take a consider there, and so I think engage early, engage that specific group early, but also sometimes it might evolve over time. We do have a colleague who ran a study like ours. And essentially she ran it 1 year and in that process identified some students who were really interested in the research while it was happening and actually ended up recruiting them for the second year. And those students actually became I think some kind of a student research leader that actually helped recruit students into the project. So they can also just take time and evolve. So that's what I would just add to that. And honestly,
I just also wanted to add because you were discussing like, oh, how do you engage the community when you're like collecting data and I think one of the key points here is if you're thinking about community engagement during data collection, that's the problem in itself. I think it needs to start like the work before the work. When I look at all of the data collection items that we designed with our community partners, all of them were like community engagement was the core of them. None of our processes just involved us going to the schools, collecting data and leaving. When we went to schools, even for the surveys, I'm thinking of the elementary students, we explained all of the survey to the students. We had them have their iPads. We were there during the process, answering questions, making them excited. This wasn't like a test for them. This is an opportunity for them to give us feedback on what mattered to them the most about these school food programs. Even for the naturally occurring focus groups, we were very flexible to every single school, what would work best for them. I'm thinking about the 3-day food records. We had videos to show the students and their families how to complete these 3-day food records. Again, making it really fun. And engaging for all of them. So again, community engagement and engaging them was just embedded in everything that we did. And when you're thinking about it, I guess like, let's just say like you're midway through data collection. I think there are different ways. I think it starts with asking like the people who are already involved, like how would you like this to be more engaging for you? I think the community has a lot of ideas. And sometimes it doesn't only have to fall on you to decide how community engagement will look like if you're deciding right at that point in the study.
Well, this actually brings us to the end of the session. We only have 2 minutes left, so I'd like to shift to closing. For those online and in person, if there are questions for said team, please feel free to reach out via email. I'm sure they would welcome any questions after the fact related to the work that they are leading. I'd like to thank one last time all of our presenters for joining us today at the Leon Center and sharing a little bit more about the work that they're engaging in at the center, as well as a special thanks to Dr. Danielle Sellen, who's right beside me, for those who are in the room and online, who's the director of their center, and for his overall academic lead on all projects that were discussed today, as well as Chelsea McPherson, who's the program manager for their center, for her administrative support for all aspects inclusive of budgets, oversight, and staffing involved in what we heard today. So thank you very much. A round of applause to everyone today. Certainly look forward to seeing you again. And for those online, have yourselves a wonderful rest of the day.